Margot Halstead learned the meaning of silence on a Tuesday morning in October. Not the gentle silence of an empty house or the peaceful silence of a Sunday afternoon. This was the kind of silence that arrives like a freight train derailing in slow motion, the kind that crashes into a life and leaves nothing standing. She was 69 years old, standing barefoot on the cold tile floor of the kitchen she had kept spotless for nearly half a century, holding a bowl of oatmeal she had prepared the way Niles liked it. A drizzle of local honey from the farm stand on Route 51, and exactly 7 blueberries. Not 6, not 8, 7. Because Niles Halstead was a man of absurd, unwavering precision, and Margot had spent 47 years learning every one of his preferences and honoring them without being asked. The bowl was still warm in her hands when she heard the front door open and close with a sound she had never heard before. A careful, deliberate click, the sound of someone leaving who did not intend to come back. She found the letter on the hallway credenza, propped against the ceramic vase she had bought on their 30th anniversary trip to Savannah. It was typed, not handwritten, 47 years of marriage, and Niles could not be bothered to pick up a pen. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph informed her that he had retained the legal services of Ellsworth, Archer, and Crane, a prestigious divorce firm in Charlotte. The second paragraph stated that he had been in a relationship with a woman named Althea Holloway for the past 4 years. She was 41, a real estate agent. They had met at a conference in Raleigh. The third paragraph contained a single line that would haunt Margot for months. It seemed almost casual in its cruelty, as if it had been dictated to a secretary between phone calls. I have already moved my personal belongings to the new residence. Please direct all further communication through my attorney. No apology, no explanation beyond the fact of Deanna's existence, no acknowledgement of the 47 years Margot had poured into building the life Niles was now discarding, like a coat that no longer fit the image he wanted to project. She stood in that hallway for 11 minutes. She knew because the grandfather clock, the one Niles's father had given them as a wedding gift, chimed twice, marking the quarter hours as Margot's world quietly collapsed around her. The oatmeal went cold in her hands. She set it down on the credenza next to the letter, and she did not cry. She would not give Niles Halstead the satisfaction, even in absentia, of her tears. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in orchestrated devastation. Niles's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Leander Ellsworth, moved with surgical efficiency. Within 14 days, Margot received formal divorce papers that read less like a dissolution of marriage and more like a corporate liquidation. Niles wanted the house, the 4-bedroom colonial in Ashford Hills they had purchased together in 1983, with Margot's teaching salary forming the backbone of the down payment. He wanted both retirement accounts, his own substantial 401k from 31 years at Pembroke Financial Services, and Margot's modest pension from the Mecklenburg County School District, where she had taught 4th grade for 28 years. He wanted the lake house in Bryson City, the one Margot had inherited from her own parents. His attorneys argued that marital improvements to the property over 2 decades had converted it into a shared asset. Margot's court-appointed attorney was a young woman named Faye Caldwell, who had graduated law school 18 months prior and carried a caseload that would have crushed someone with twice her experience. Katie was earnest and hardworking, but she was badly outgunned. Ellsworth had 4 paralegals and a forensic accountant. Katie had a shared office and a printer that jammed every 3rd page. The first mediation session set the tone for everything that followed. Niles sat across the conference table in a new suit that Margot had never seen, his silver hair freshly cut, looking at her with the practiced detachment of a man who had already mentally filed her under a closed account. But it was not Niles's indifference that cut deepest that day. It was Althea Holloway sitting in the gallery row behind Niles's legal team. She had no legal reason to be there. She was not a party to the proceedings, not a witness, not a consultant. She was there because Niles wanted Margot to see her. And around Diana's wrist, catching the fluorescent light of the conference room every time she moved her hand, was a jade bracelet that Margot recognized instantly. She had given that bracelet to Niles for their 40th anniversary. He had told her 6 months later that he had lost it at the golf course, that it must have slipped off during a round, that he was sorry. And Margot had believed him because after 40 years you stop questioning the small lies. You do not realize until much later that the small lies were rehearsals for the big one. Faye Caldwell noticed Margot staring and leaned close. "Are you all right?" Margot nodded, but she was not all right. She was watching the physical evidence of her husband's deception wrapped around another woman's wrist, displayed like a trophy in a room full of lawyers who were being paid by the hour to divide her life into columns on a spreadsheet. Katie objected to Diana's presence before the mediating judge. The objection was overruled. Diana was merely an observer, a member of the public. She had every right to sit there and watch Margot's marriage be dismantled piece by piece. The second mediation session was worse, not because of Diana, who did not return, but because of a detail so small that no one else in the room would have noticed it. Margot sat across from Niles as his attorneys presented their asset inventory, and she saw on his left wrist a watch she had never seen before. It was old, clearly vintage, with a worn leather band and a brass case that had been polished so many times the edges were smooth. She could not read the engraving from across the table, but when Niles reached for his water glass, the case turned just enough for her to catch two letters etched into the back. G. Not Niles's initials, not Diana's, not anyone Margot knew. She filed the detail away in the same mental cabinet where she had stored nearly 5 decades of observations about the man she had married. The cabinet she was only now beginning to understand she should have opened much sooner. By the time the divorce was finalized 5 months later, Margot Halstead walked away from nearly half a century of marriage with a 2009 Honda Accord that needed new brakes, $11,400 in a checking account, her personal clothing, and a small cardboard box of photographs that Niles's attorney had deemed of no financial value. She lost the house. She lost the lake property in Bryson City after a judge ruled that Niles's renovations constituted significant marital investment. She lost 80% of their combined retirement earnings to a formula that somehow determined Niles's earning potential outweighed Margot's decades of unpaid domestic labor. The 30 years of meals cooked holidays orchestrated a household managed with the quiet, invisible competence that the legal system had no column for on its spreadsheets. Her 2 adult children offered what Margot came to recognize as performative sympathy. Her son Leland, a 44-year-old investment banker in Atlanta, called her twice during the entire divorce proceeding. Both calls lasted under 10 minutes. He told her that he did not want to take sides, which Margot understood to mean that he had already taken Niles's. This suspicion was confirmed when Leland's wife, Della, posted photographs on social media of a dinner party at their Buckhead townhouse. Niles and Diana were seated at the table smiling, holding wine glasses, looking for all the world like a couple who had been together for decades rather than a man who had abandoned his wife of 47 years and the woman he had been hiding for 4 of them. Margot's daughter, Opal, who lived in Denver, was more vocal but equally absent. She called every Sunday for exactly 15 minutes, filling the silence with hollow encouragements. "You are strong, Mom. This is your chance to reinvent yourself." Phrases that sounded like they had been copied from a self-help podcast. Neither Leland nor Opal offered Margot a room in their homes. Neither offered financial help. When Margot asked Opal directly if she could stay in her guest bedroom for a few weeks while she found an apartment, there was a pause on the line that lasted long enough for Margot to hear the answer before her daughter spoke it. "It is just that the timing is not great, Mom. Sheldon and I are redoing the basement." Margot hung up the phone and sat in the parking lot of a Comfort Inn where she had been staying for 9 days, burning through her dwindling savings at $79 a night. She was 69 years old. She had devoted her entire adult life to a family that had, in the span of 5 months, discarded her with the efficiency of a corporate restructuring. That night alone in the motel room with its stained ceiling and the faint smell of bleach that never quite covered the smell of neglect, Margot did something she had avoided for 5 months. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and allowed herself to think the thought she had been outrunning since the morning Niles left. Maybe she deserved this. Maybe 47 years of cooking and cleaning and organizing and managing and teaching other people's children and raising her own and keeping the house and keeping the peace and keeping everything running so smoothly that no one ever noticed it was running at all. Maybe all of that was worth exactly what the legal system said it was worth. Nothing. Maybe Niles was right to leave. Maybe Leland and Opal were right to close their doors. Maybe a woman who had spent her entire life making herself useful had simply outlived her usefulness. She sat with that thought for 20 minutes. It was the longest 20 minutes of her life, longer than the 11 minutes in the hallway, longer than the 5 months of legal proceedings, because this was not grief. This was something worse. This was the possibility that the grief was justified. Then she stood up. She turned on the bathroom light, the cheap fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered before catching. She looked at herself in the motel mirror, the kind of mirror that flatters no one, and she said it out loud, very quietly, almost a whisper. "No, he is wrong." She did not say it because she believed it. She said it because if she did not say it, she would never get up from that motel bed. And Margot Halstead, whatever else she might have lost, was not a woman who stayed down. It was Faye Caldwell who changed everything, though she did it entirely by accident. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Katie called Margot on a Wednesday afternoon. Her voice carried the particular tension of someone who has discovered a mistake they are not sure how to explain. "Mrs. Prescott," Katie began carefully, "I need to discuss something with you regarding the final asset distribution." During the mediation process, Leander Ellsworth's office had submitted a comprehensive inventory of all properties held jointly or individually by Niles. As part of the final settlement, several properties were allocated to Niles's column, and a small number of residual assets were allocated to Margot's. A clerical error in Ellsworth's office had resulted in one property being placed in Margot's distribution column that was likely intended for Niles's. A property located at 14 Pennington Hollow Road, Dunlap County, Virginia. The deed had been transferred into Margot's name as part of the finalized settlement documents. And because the decree had already been signed and entered by the judge, the transfer was legally binding. Margot stared at the stained ceiling of her motel room. She had never heard of Pennington Hollow Road. She had never heard of a property in Dunlap County. In 47 years of marriage, Niles had never once mentioned owning land in rural Virginia. "What kind of property is it?" Margot asked. "According to county records," Katie said, "it is a residential estate on approximately 12 acres. The structures include a main stone house and several outbuildings. It was originally purchased in 1955 by a man named Whitfield Pennington. Ownership transferred to Niles Halstead through a private transaction in 2003. There are no active liens, no mortgage, and property taxes have been paid through a blind trust administered by Mr. Ellsworth's firm." Katie paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted from cautious to something closer to sharp. "Mrs. Prescott, I have to be transparent with you. Mr. Ellsworth has already contacted me demanding the property be returned. He claims it was a filing error. But the settlement decree is final. That property is legally yours. Then Katie added something that made Margot's breath catch. I checked the tax records for the blind trust. The price Niles paid for this property in 2003 was $2.1 million. The county's assessed value is $68,000. He paid more than 30 times market value. Nobody does that unless they know something the market does not. Margot sat on the edge of the motel bed for a long time after she hung up. Niles had secretly owned a property in Virginia for over 20 years. He had kept it hidden from her, paid for through a blind trust she had never known existed, administered by the very attorney who had just spent 5 months dismantling her life. He had paid 30 times its apparent value. And now, through the particular poetry of a paralegal's clerical error, it belonged to her. She packed her cardboard box, checked out of the Comfort Inn, and drove south. The drive from Charlotte to Dunlap County, Virginia, took just under 4 hours, carrying her deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains along increasingly narrow roads that wound through hollows thick with sugar maples and white oaks shedding their autumn leaves. The GPS signal died 40 minutes before she arrived, forcing her to navigate by a hand-drawn map Faye Caldwell had emailed based on the county surveyor's records. Pennington Hollow Road was not a road in any modern sense of the word. It was a single-lane gravel track that branched off a state route and climbed steeply through dense hardwood forest for nearly 2 miles before leveling out on a ridgeline that offered a sweeping view of the Appalachian foothills below. When Margot finally brought the Honda to a stop at the end of the drive, she sat behind the wheel for a full minute, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had expected. She had expected ruin, a collapsed shack or a mildewed trailer, the kind of worthless property Niles might have acquired as a tax shelter and forgotten about. What she found was something entirely different. The house was built of native fieldstone, hand-cut blocks of gray and amber granite, fitted together with the kind of meticulous craftsmanship that modern construction had abandoned decades ago. It was 2 stories tall with a steeply pitched slate roof, arched windows with leaded glass panes, and a wide covered porch supported by thick stone columns. It was beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful when they have been built by someone who understood that beauty and endurance are the same quality. But it was also profoundly neglected. Virginia creeper and English ivy had consumed the entire eastern wall, prying into the mortar joints and cracking the stone. The porch roof sagged dangerously on the left side where a support column had shifted. The yard, if it could be called that, was a waist-high field of dead goldenrod and wild thistle. Every window on the ground floor was shuttered from the inside. Heavy wooden shutters that appeared to have been nailed closed. Every window, every door, sealed. Margot reached for the door handle and stopped. A voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the silence from the tree line to her left. "This is private property. Turn the car around." A man stepped out from a narrow trail between the oaks. He was old, late 70s at least, with the lean, weathered frame of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. He wore a canvas jacket patched at the elbows and carried a hunting rifle resting across his shoulder with the casual ease of a man who considered it an extension of his arm. Harlan Fulton. Margot would learn his name later. For now, he was a stranger with a gun standing between her and the only thing she owned in the world. "I am the legal owner of this property," Margot said. She kept her voice level. "I have the deed in my car." Tom did not lower the rifle. "The last person who claimed to own this place drove a black Mercedes up here twice in 20 years. Each time he walked around the house like a thief casing a job, never went inside, never knocked on my door, and drove away. I do not trust people who drive Mercedes, and I have not yet found a reason to trust you." I drive a 2009 Honda Accord that needs new brakes, Margot said. I have $11,400 in my checking account, and I do not have anywhere else to go. You can check my paperwork or you can shoot me, but I am not turning around. The rifle lowered an inch, then two. Tom studied her face with unhurried assessment of a man who had survived long enough to know that the most important judgments cannot be rushed. The man with the Mercedes, he said. What is his name? Niles Halstead, my ex-husband. Something shifted in Tom's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of a shared enemy. He is the one who bought this land out from under old Pennington's daughter. Showed up when she owed $180,000 in medical bills for her dying husband. Told her if she did not sell, he would report her father to the federal government for stealing institutional property, and she would be prosecuted as an accomplice. Tom spat to one side. She sold because she was scared, not because she wanted to, and that man took Whitfield Pennington's pocket watch from inside the house as a bonus, called it part of the deal. The watch, WG, the initials on the vintage timepiece Margot had seen on Niles's wrist in the mediation room. Whitfield Pennington's pocket watch worn by the man who had bullied an old woman into selling her father's land. Margot's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She had spent a lifetime believing she knew who Niles was. She was beginning to understand that she had not known the first thing about him. Tom stepped aside, though he did not put the rifle away entirely. Margot got out of the car and walked up the stone path toward the front porch. The silence on the ridgeline was immense, broken only by wind through bare branches and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the valley below. The front door was solid oak, darkened by decades of weather, secured by a heavy brass deadbolt that showed no signs of rust. She tried the key that Faye Caldwell had sent via certified mail, a single brass key filed with the original deed. The lock resisted for a moment, then turned with a deep, satisfying click that echoed off the stone walls. She pushed the door open. The hinges groaned but held. A wave of air rushed out to meet her, cold and dry, and carrying a scent she could not immediately identify. Something between old paper and cedar and the faintest trace of machine oil. The interior was dark, the shuttered windows blocking all natural light. Margot pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight. The beam swept across a foyer floored in dark hardwood, the planks wide and hand-pegged in a style that predated plywood by generations. A staircase with a carved oak banister rose to the second floor. To the left, a sitting room. To the right, a formal dining room. Directly ahead, a hallway leading toward the back of the house. Everything was covered in a uniform layer of dust, thick and undisturbed, the kind that accumulates not over years but over decades. And yet beneath the dust, the house was immaculate. The furniture was intact, covered in white cotton sheets. The walls bore framed artwork, landscapes, and botanical prints, their glass panes clouded but unbroken. The floors, despite years of neglect, were solid and level. No water damage, no evidence of animal intrusion, no mold. The house had been sealed with such precision that time itself seemed to have been locked out. This was not abandonment. This was preservation. Deliberate, expert, methodical preservation. Margot moved through the ground floor slowly. The kitchen was modest by modern standards, but equipped with a cast-iron cook stove, a hand-pump well sink, and open shelving lined with mason jars that still contained preserved fruits and vegetables. Their contents darkened, but their seals unbroken. She found the study at the back of the house, a small room with built-in bookshelves lining every wall. Hundreds of volumes, leather-bound and cloth-covered, filled the shelves in neat rows. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered by a leather blotter and a collection of fountain pens arranged with military precision. On the desk, positioned as if someone had set it down moments ago and intended to return, was a framed photograph. Margot picked it up and wiped the dust from the glass with her sleeve. The photograph showed a man in his 50s, lean and sharp-featured, standing in front of this very house. He wore a dark suit and held a wooden crate in his arms. Behind him, the front door was open, and through the doorway, a woman could be seen carrying another crate inside. Margot turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, June 1958, the last load. Everything is inside. Lock it and leave. Do not return until it is safe. WG. UG. She looked at the two initials for a long time. Then she looked at the photograph again, at the man carrying the crate through the doorway with the urgency of someone who knew he was running out of time. Whitfield Pennington, the original owner, the man whose pocket watch Niles wore on his wrist like a souvenir. On the lower shelves, she found them. Not books, but archival boxes. Gray acid-free containers labeled in a careful, precise hand with dates and catalog numbers. 19 boxes in total. She pulled one from the shelf and opened it. Inside were documents, dozens of them typed on heavy cotton bond paper and bearing official letterheads she recognized immediately. The Smithsonian Institution, the National Gallery of Art, the Library of Congress. Margot did not understand yet what she was looking at, but something tightened in her chest. The same instinct that had told her Niles was lying years before she ever found proof. The same instinct that had watched him wear a dead man's watch and filed it away for future examination. This house was not simply old. It was not simply sealed. Something had been placed here carefully, deliberately, and hidden from the world for almost 70 years. She closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. She walked to the window and pried one of the interior shutters open for the first time since 1958. Amber afternoon light poured into the study, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air like tiny galaxies. She looked out at the 12 acres of overgrown Virginia ridgeline that now belonged to her. The stone house, the sealed rooms she had not yet opened, the outbuildings whose doors were padlocked and whose windows were boarded. She thought about Niles, who had owned this property for 20 years and never told her. She thought about Leander Ellsworth, whose clerical error had accidentally handed her the one secret Niles had fought hardest to keep. She thought about Leland and Opal, who could not find room for their mother in their busy, comfortable lives. And for the first time since the morning Niles left, Margot Halstead felt something other than emptiness. It was small, fragile, unfamiliar, like a match struck in a dark room, but it was real. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed Faye Caldwell. "Katie," she said quietly, looking at the sealed door at the far end of the hallway that she had not yet tried to open. "I am keeping the house, and I need you to make sure that no one, not Niles, not Ellsworth, not anyone can take it from me." The silence on the other end lasted 2 beats. Then Faye Caldwell's voice came back sharp and steady. "Already on it, Mrs. Prescott. I filed a motion to preserve the settlement decree this morning. Niles's attorney has no legal standing to reclaim it. That property is yours." Margot hung up and looked at the sealed door at the end of the hall. Whatever Whitfield Pennington had locked inside this house in 1958 had been waiting for 67 years. It could wait one more night. She had a car to unload, a fireplace to light, and for the first time in months, a door of her own to close behind her. The first week at Pennington Hollow tested Margot Halstead in ways she had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. The house, for all its structural integrity, had no running water, no functioning electricity, and no heat source beyond the massive stone fireplace in the sitting room and the cast-iron cook stove in the kitchen. October in the Virginia Blue Ridge meant mornings that arrived with frost on the inside of the windows and evenings that drove the temperature into the low 30s. She slept on the settee in the sitting room, wrapped in every blanket she had brought from the Comfort Inn, feeding the fireplace with deadfall branches she dragged from the tree line until her arms ached and her palms split open against the rough bark. She learned on the second night that green wood does not burn. She learned on the third night that the draft in the chimney reversed when the wind shifted north, filling the room with smoke that drove her onto the porch at 2 in the morning, coughing and shivering in the dark, while the temperature dropped below freezing. She was 69 years old. Her left knee had been complaining since 2018. Her lower back seized if she bent wrong. And she was living like a frontier settler in a house built before Eisenhower left office, with no one to call and no one coming to help. On the third morning, she found a bundle of dry split oak on the porch steps. Next to it, a gallon jug of clean water. No note, no knock. She looked toward the tree line and saw nothing but bare branches and gray skikam. The fourth morning, a box of waterproof matches appeared in the same spot. The fifth morning, Margot opened the front door at the exact moment Harlan Fulton was setting down a flashlight on the top step. He straightened up like a man caught stealing, rather than giving his weathered face carrying an expression that sat somewhere between embarrassment and defiance. "You could come inside for coffee instead of playing mysterious benefactor," Margot said. Tom hesitated at the threshold. He looked past her into the foyer, and something crossed his face that Margot recognized because she had felt it herself the first time she stepped inside. The weight of returning to a place that holds the ghost of someone you knew. He stepped in. It was the first time he'd been inside the house since Whitfield Pennington was alive. His eyes moved across the sitting room and stopped at the grandfather clock standing silent against the far wall. Its pendulum hung motionless behind beveled glass, frozen at 3:15 on some forgotten afternoon decades ago. "Walter wound that clock every Sunday," Tom said. "I could hear it chiming from my cabin when the wind was right. One day it stopped. That was how I knew he was not coming back." They sat in the kitchen while Margot boiled water on the cook stove, which she had finally learned to operate without filling the room with smoke. Tom told her what he knew about Whitfield Pennington, which was the kind of knowledge that comes not from conversation, but from proximity. 30 years of living half a mile from a man who rarely spoke, but whose habits were as regular as the seasons. Walter had arrived on the ridge in 1958 with a borrowed truck and enough crates to fill 3 rooms. He had spent 6 months sealing the house from the inside, methodical and unhurried, then walked out, locked the front door, and never returned. He moved into a rented room above Royce Whittaker's hardware store in Dunlap Station and lived there until he died in 1979. He never explained why he left Washington. He never explained what was in the crates. He never once in 21 years drove back up the mountain to check on the house he had sealed with such extraordinary care. "He asked me to watch the land," Tom said, "not with a contract, with a handshake. I was 20 years old, just back from Korea building my cabin. He looked at me like he was sizing up whether I could be trusted with something important. Then he shook my hand and said, 'If anyone comes for the house, send them away. If they come with authority, call my daughter. If they come with tools, call the sheriff.' I asked him what was inside. He said the kind of thing that gets a man killed or canonized, depending on who opens the door." Margot drove into Dunlap Station that afternoon for supplies. The town was the kind of place that had once been prosperous and was now surviving on stubbornness. A single main street lined with the brick storefronts, half of them vacant. A hardware store, a post office, a diner called Ruby's, with a faded red awning, and a volunteer fire station. Royce Whittaker, the hardware store owner, was a wiry man in his 70s who moved with the deliberate caution of someone whose joints had long since filed a formal complaint. He studied Margot with undisguised curiosity as she loaded a cart with kerosene lanterns weather stripping, and hand tools. "You ought to talk to Darla Pennington before you start opening doors in that house," Boyd said as she was loading bags into her car. She is Walter's daughter, 86 years old, lives in the assisted care home outside Dunmore. She is the only person alive who knows why her daddy sealed that place up and walked away. Margot drove to the Dunmore Valley Assisted Living Center on a Friday morning, following 30 miles of mountain road flanked by forests so dense the bare canopy formed a tunnel against the pale autumn sky. The facility was a single-story brick building set back from the road behind a parking lot holding exactly 4 cars. Inside it smelled of disinfectant and instant coffee, and the young nurse at the front desk looked up with the mildly startled expression of someone who rarely saw visitors. Darla Pennington sat in a high-backed chair beside the window of her room, her small frame nearly swallowed by a hand-knitted afghan draped across her lap. She was 86 years old, but her eyes, dark brown and startlingly sharp, tracked Margot's entrance with the alertness of a woman whose mind had outlasted her body by a comfortable margin. "You are the woman who got the house," Ruth said before Margot could introduce herself. "Boyd called me, said a woman from North Carolina moved in and was asking questions." Margot sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed. "I am not here to disturb you, Mrs. Pennington. I just want to understand the house. Your father sealed it in 1958. Every window, every door from the inside. And he never went back." Ruth stared at her for a long time, her weathered fingers working the fringe of the afghan with a slow, rhythmic motion. "He could not go back," Ruth said quietly. "Going back would have meant admitting what he had done. And admitting what he had done would have destroyed him and everyone he was trying to protect." "What did he do?" Ruth turned her gaze toward the window. "My father was a conservator, not a collector, not a dealer, a conservator. He spent his entire career preserving things that other people wanted to forget, neglect, or destroy. He worked for the Smithsonian for 23 years, from 1934 to 1957. He was responsible for the care, restoration, and storage of works that the institution considered too fragile, too controversial, or too politically sensitive for public display." She paused, and Margot waited, understanding that this story would arrive at its own pace. "In 1957, my father discovered that a newly appointed deputy director named Blaine Braddock was orchestrating the quiet disposal of items from the permanent collection. Not officially, no records, no deaccession papers, no board approvals. He was selling pieces through private channels and funneling the money into personal accounts. My father documented everything, photographed the inventory discrepancies, copied the internal transfer logs. He brought his evidence to the director himself." "What happened?" Ruth's lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. "The director was the deputy director's brother-in-law. My father was terminated within 72 hours. They called it a reduction in force. He was escorted from the building with nothing but his personal effects." Ruth lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room to hear. "But before they locked him out, he did something that would have landed him in federal prison if anyone had ever found out. He took them, the pieces that were being sold off. He could not bear to watch them disappear into private collections where no one would ever see them again. He loaded them into crates over the course of 3 nights, drove them to Virginia in a borrowed truck, and sealed them inside the house on Pennington Hollow Road. He spent the rest of his life terrified that someone would come looking." Ruth stopped. Her fingers tightened on the afghan fringe until her knuckles went white. "And then in 2003, someone did come. A man in an expensive suit, spoke softly, said he wanted to buy the land to preserve Whitfield Pennington's legacy." Ruth's voice went flat, drained of everything but the memory of fear. "I owed $180,000 in hospital bills. My husband had been dying of lung cancer for 2 years. That man said if I did not sell, he would report my father to the federal government, and I would be prosecuted as an accomplice to the theft of national property. She looked at Margot. I sold because I was terrified, and he took my father's pocket watch from the house as a bonus, said it was part of the deal. Margot sat very still. She already knew this part. She had seen the watch on Niles's wrist. She had seen the initials. But hearing Ruth say it, hearing the shame and the anger in the old woman's voice, turned knowledge into something heavier. Something that sat in Margot's chest and would not move. Mrs. Pennington, Margot said carefully, what exactly did your father take? I do not know everything. He never told me the full inventory. He said it was safer if I did not know. But I know there are paintings, I know there are manuscripts, and I know there is at least one item that my father said was worth more than anything money could buy. He called it the cornerstone. He said the cornerstone was the reason the deputy director wanted everything destroyed, because if it ever surfaced, it would prove what had been stolen and by whom. Margot drove back to Pennington Hollow with her hands tight on the steering wheel. That night, she sat alone in the study with the kerosene lantern burning low, the wind pressing against the shuttered windows, and she allowed herself to feel the things she had been holding at arm's length since she arrived on this mountain. Doubt, not about the house, not about Niles, about herself. She had heard Ruth's story about Whitfield Pennington, a man who had sacrificed his career, his peace of mind, his relationship with an own daughter to protect things he believed the world deserved to see. A man of expertise, a man of institutional knowledge, a man who understood exactly what he was preserving and why it mattered. And who was she? A retired fourth-grade teacher from North Carolina. She could not tell an original canvas from a reproduction. She did not understand cultural property law. She was 69 years old. Her knee ached every morning, and last week she had given herself a bruise on the forehead because she did not know how to work a hand pump. Perhaps she should sell. Take Ellsworth's $75,000, rent a small apartment in Charlotte, live quietly for whatever years remained. That was the sensible choice, the practical choice, the choice a woman her age was supposed to make. She looked at the photograph on the desk. Whitfield Pennington, carrying a crate through a doorway in 1958. He had not been anyone special either. He was a conservator, a man who repaired and protected things that other people wanted to throw away. Just like Margot, 47 years of holding a family together that ultimately threw her away. The difference was that Walter had done it because he believed in the value of what he was protecting. Margot had done it because she did not know how to stop. But now, for the first time in her life, she had a choice. She could protect something because she wanted to, not because she had to, not because someone expected it, because she chose it. She set the photograph down. She was not selling. 4 days later, the choice was nearly taken from her. A black Mercedes SUV appeared at the end of the gravel drive on a Thursday afternoon. Margot was on the porch replacing a rotted support post with a locust timber she had dragged from the wood line when the vehicle climbed the ridge slowly, its suspension protesting every rut and stone. 2 men emerged. Leander Ellsworth, Niles's attorney, in a charcoal overcoat that belonged on a Charlotte sidewalk, not a mountain road, and a second man Margot did not recognize. Younger, broad-shouldered, carrying a leather portfolio. Mrs. Prescott, Ellsworth called out, approaching the porch with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to making unpleasant things sound reasonable. I hope you do not mind the unannounced visit. We were in the area and thought we might discuss the property matter informally. Margot set down her hammer and stood. She did not invite them onto the porch. You drove 4 hours from Charlotte to have an informal conversation, Mr. Ellsworth. Ellsworth smiled, the kind of smile that reveals nothing. This is my colleague Orville Stockwell. He specializes in estate appraisals and asset recovery. Niles is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement of $75,000 in exchange for the deed. That is well above the county's assessed value. The county's assessed value, Margot said slowly, is $68,000, but you drove 4 hours and brought an asset recovery specialist to offer me $75,000. That is a $7,000 premium for a property your office described in the divorce proceedings as a worthless rural parcel of no significant value. Ellsworth's smile tightened. It is a generous offer, Mrs. Prescott. The maintenance costs alone on a structure this old would exceed the property's value within 2 years. You are a retired school teacher on a fixed income. This is the practical choice. When Margot shook her head, Ellsworth changed tactics. He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick document on the porch railing. This is the complaint we will file on Monday. We will argue that you, an individual with no conservation expertise, are endangering a property of historical value by occupying it without climate control, fire suppression, or moisture management systems. The court will appoint a property guardian, and that guardian will have physical control of the house and everything inside it. Orville Stockwell spoke for the first time. I have appraised over 200 historic properties, Mrs. Prescott. Living in a structure like this without proper systems constitutes material endangerment of heritage assets. His voice was polite and measured, but his eyes were doing something entirely different. They were scanning the stone walls, the shuttered windows, the padlocked outbuildings with an intensity that had nothing to do with standard appraisal. Margot felt the blood cool in her veins. This was not a bluff. A guardianship petition was a real legal mechanism, and against a retired teacher with no resources it could work. She stepped down from the porch and walked directly to Ellsworth, stopping close enough that he took an involuntary half-step backward. Mr. Ellsworth, I spent 28 years teaching 9-year-olds how to recognize when someone is trying to trick them. You are not as subtle as a 4th grader. This property is not worthless. You know it, Niles knows it, and now I know it. So here is what I need you to understand. I am not selling. I am not negotiating. And the next time you drive up this mountain without an invitation, I will have the Dunlap County Sheriff escort you back down. Get off my land. Ellsworth stared at her. The practiced composure cracked. Something cold surfaced behind his eyes. You are making a mistake, Margot. Niles has resources you cannot imagine. He can tie this property up in litigation for a decade. Then I suppose he had better get started, because I am not going anywhere. She watched the Mercedes back down the gravel drive and disappear into the trees. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger. Pure, clarifying anger that had been building for 5 months and had finally found its proper target. As the engine noise faded, Harlan Fulton stepped out from the tree-lined rifle across his shoulder. I heard everything, he said. That man in the overcoat has been up here twice before, 2015 and 2019. Both times he brought a locksmith. I ran them off before they touched a door. Margot stared at him. Why did you not tell me sooner? Because until today, I was not sure you were not one of his people. Niles had twice sent people to try to break into the house. He knew what was inside, and he would not stop at $75,000 or a guardianship petition. That evening, Margot began opening the archival boxes systematically. She worked through the night, laying contents on the desk in careful rows by lantern light. Correspondence between Whitfield, Pennington, and colleagues at the Smithsonian, the National Gallery, and the Library of Congress, spanning 1935 to 1957. Internal inventory reports with acquisition numbers and condition assessments. Then beginning in late 1956, a different kind of document, Handwritten notes in Walter's increasingly agitated script, documenting discrepancies between the official catalog and the physical inventory. Items listed as in storage that were no longer on the shelves. Transfer orders bearing signatures that Walter identified as forged, and one name appearing again and again in the margins circled, underlined, and notated with dates and dollar amounts. Blaine Braddock. In box 17, Margot found something Walter had hidden separately. A sealed envelope closed with red wax that had dried to the color of old blood. Inside was a handwritten letter on institutional stationery dated 1957 from the director of the Smithsonian to Blaine Braddock, written after Walter's termination. The Pennington matter has been resolved. The items he cataloged will be recorded as damaged by water and removed from the inventory. No further action is required. Margot read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down on the desk and pressed her hands flat against the wood to stop them from trembling. This was not merely a cover-up. The Smithsonian had not simply looked the other way while Braddock stole from the collection. The institution itself had actively destroyed the records. They had erased the evidence of theft from their own books, classified irreplaceable works as damaged and destroyed, and fired the one man who had tried to stop it. The archival boxes were not just Whitfield Pennington's personal records. They were the evidentiary chain, the paper trail connecting stolen objects to the man who stole them and the institution that helped him do it. She understood now what Ruth had meant by the cornerstone. Without these documents, whatever was behind the sealed doors of this house was simply old things with no provenance, no legal standing, no way to prove where they had come from. With the documents, they were evidence of one of the largest institutional art thefts in American history. And Niles, through whatever back-channel whisper had led him to this property, knew it. Margot called Faye Caldwell the next morning. "Katie, I need you to find me someone at the Smithsonian, not an administrator, not a board member, a conservator. Someone who cares about what has been lost more than what it is worth." She paused, and Katie checked whether anyone on the Smithsonian Board of Trustees has the last name Braddock. Katie called back 4 hours later. Her voice was careful in the way it always became when she had found something significant. "Grover Braddock, Blaine Braddock's grandson. He has been a board member since 2018. A pause. "And I found your conservator, Dr. Colleen Bancroft, chief conservator, 30-year veteran of cultural recovery. She has spent 11 years trying to determine what happened to the items that went missing from the Smithsonian in 1958. And from what I can tell, she and Grover Braddock are not on friendly terms." Margot hung up and sat for a long time in the study, turning the pieces over in her mind. The grandson of the man who had orchestrated the original theft was sitting on the board of the institution his grandfather had robbed. If Margot contacted the Smithsonian carelessly, she could be delivering Whitfield Pennington's evidence directly into the hands of the family that had spent 67 years burying the truth. She would have to be precise. She would have to be patient. And she would have to move before Niles and Ellsworth found a way to take the house out from under her. But before Margot could act on any of it, the mountain delivered its own reckoning. On the 3rd night of November, a storm system that the Weather Service had classified as a once-in-a-decade event descended on the Blue Ridge. The wind arrived first, a sustained 40-mile-per-hour assault that bent the oaks on the ridgeline to impossible angles. Then the rain not falling but driving sideways, hammering the stone walls with a force that made the lated glass vibrate in their frames. Margot sat in the study with 2 kerosene lanterns and a fire in the small cast-iron stove, listening to the house groan around her. Just past midnight, a sound cut through the roar, a deep structural crack that resonated through the walls. The floor shuddered. She grabbed a lantern and moved toward the sound. It had come from the back of the house, from behind the sealed door at the end of the hallway. The storm had done what 67 years of stillness had not. The stone wall to the left of the sealed door had shifted, cracked by water seeping into the mortar from the saturated hillside behind the house. A section the size of a dinner table had buckled inward, and through the gap, Margot could feel a rush of impossibly dry air flowing from the space beyond. She held the lantern to the opening. The light pushed into the gap and illuminated the edge of something she had not expected. Not another room, a staircase carved from native stone descending steeply into the earth. But before she could process what she was seeing, a different light caught her attention. From outside. Through the sitting room window, a flashlight beam swept across the porch. Margot killed her lantern. In the darkness, she moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. Two figures in black rain gear hoods up against the storm were working at the padlock on the nearest outbuilding. One held a flashlight, the other held bolt cutters. They had come in the storm, under cover of wind and rain, and the certainty that no one would hear them and no one would see. Margot's hands found the hunting rifle Harlan Fulton had left beside the front door the week before. In case of bears, he had said. They both knew he was not talking about bears. She opened the front door. The wind hit her like a wall rain driving into her face. She raised the rifle and fired once into the air. The report shattered the night louder than the storm, echoing off the stone walls and rolling down the ridge like thunder. The two figures froze. Their flashlight swung toward the porch, caught Margot standing in the doorway, white hair plastered to her skull, a rifle at her shoulder, and then the light went out. Footsteps. Running. An engine starting at the far end of the gravel drive, tires spinning on wet stone, then fading down the mountain. Harlan Fulton appeared 10 minutes later, soaked to the bone, his own rifle in hand. "I heard the shot. Are you all right?" Margot stood on the porch, rain streaming down her face. "I am fine, and I just found what they were looking for." She told him about the staircase. Tom looked at her for a long time, the rain running off the brim of his hat. "Then we stand watch tonight," he said. "Tomorrow morning you go down." They sat on opposite ends of the porch through the remaining hours of darkness. Two old people with rifles and lanterns guarding a house full of secrets, while the storm spent the last of its fury against the mountain. They did not speak. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who understood that some things do not require words to be agreed upon. At first light, when the storm had exhausted itself and the ridge lay quiet under a sky washed pale and clean, Margot stepped through the gap in the cracked wall and began to descend. 22 steps. She counted each one, her free hand trailing along the stone wall for balance. The air changed with every step. Warmer air gave way to cool, then cold, then a stillness so complete it felt like entering a sealed chamber, which is exactly what it was. The wooden shelving on both sides held small items she could not identify in the lantern light. Metal boxes, glass jars sealed with wax-rolled tubes. At the bottom, a short corridor, perhaps 15 feet, ending at a door unlike anything else in the house. Steel industrial gauge, set into a steel frame, bolted directly into bedrock. A heavy lever handle on the right side. Margot gripped it and pulled. The door swung open on hinges so perfectly balanced that it moved with the pressure of a single hand despite weighing several hundred pounds. The lantern light flooded the space beyond. The room was enormous. Whitfield Pennington had not dug a cellar. He had excavated a chamber carved directly into the bedrock of the Virginia Ridge. Walls of smooth, sealed concrete, an arched ceiling supported by steel beams, a floor of poured concrete covered in heavy rubber matting, a passive ventilation system of narrow copper pipes running along the ceiling and disappearing into the stone, using the natural thermal stability of the bedrock to maintain conditions that would preserve organic materials for centuries. Along the left wall, standing upright in custom-built wooden racks padded with wool felt, were paintings, not prints, not reproductions, original canvases in ornate gilded frames, some massive 6 feet tall, others small and intimate, each separated by padded wooden dividers. 14 paintings. She could not identify the artist from where she stood, but she could see the depth of color preserved by decades in perfect darkness, the craquelure of aged oil paint that spoke of centuries, and the institutional catalog tags still wired to the lower corners of each frame. Along the right wall, flat wooden cases on steel shelving. She opened the nearest. Inside, cradled in yellowed acid-free tissue paper, was a manuscript. Handwritten on heavy rag paper, the ink faded to deep sepia, the script a flowing copperplate that belonged to a period long before typewriters existed. More cases, 7 on the first shelf alone. Manuscripts, letters, bound journals. The second shelf held large format cartographic documents in sealed tubes. The third shelf held small wooden boxes lined with velvet, each containing scientific instruments of extraordinary craftsmanship, sextants and astrolabes and magnifying apparatus that belonged in a museum of natural history. And at the far end of the chamber, standing alone on a heavy oak pedestal, was a single object covered by a linen cloth. Margot walked toward it slowly, the lantern casting long shadows against the arched ceiling. She reached out and lifted the cloth. A painting, smaller than the others, perhaps 18 inches by 24, a simple gilded frame, a woman seated by a window, her face turned slightly away from the viewer, her hands resting in her lap, the light falling across her features with a warmth and precision that made the figure seem not painted, but breathing. Margot stood before it, and for the first time in all her years of visiting museums on school field trips, standing in front of paintings she admired but never truly understood, she felt the thing that separates great art from everything else. The painting looked back at her. It saw her, a woman alone in an underground chamber holding a lantern, 69 years old with nothing in the world but a stone house and a Honda that needed brakes. And the painting said, "I have been waiting for you." She replaced the linen cloth with careful hands. She climbed the 22 steps back to the hallway, stepped through the gap in the cracked wall, and stood in the dark corridor while dawn light seeped through the cracks in the shuttered windows. She was a retired school teacher, standing on top of what was likely one of the most significant cultural recoveries in American history, and she was completely terrifyingly alone. She did not sleep. She sat in the study with the door locked and the fire burning, guarding the house the way Whitfield Pennington had guarded it for the final decades of his life. At first light, she picked up her phone and called Faye Caldwell. "Katie," she said, "I found it, the sealed space underneath the house. And what is inside is beyond anything I imagined. I need someone from the Smithsonian here, not tomorrow, today." Faye Caldwell, to her enduring credit, did not ask Margot if she was sure. She did not ask for details over the phone. She said 3 words: "I am on it." Faye Caldwell moved with a ferocity that belied her 18 months of legal experience. Within 2 hours of Margot's call, she had bypassed every layer of bureaucratic insulation at the Smithsonian's Office of the Inspector General to reach a woman named Dr. Colleen Bancroft, the institution's chief conservator and a 30-year veteran of cultural recovery operations. Katie summarized the situation in 4 minutes. Dr. Bancroft asked 4 precise questions. 3 hours later, she was on a flight from Washington to Roanoke. She arrived at Pennington Hollow the following morning in a rented SUV packed with portable examination equipment, acid-free containers, and a forensic documentation kit that she handled with the practiced care of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. She was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the quiet, concentrated intensity of someone who had spent her career in the company of objects that demanded absolute respect. She climbed the porch steps, shook Margot's hand with a grip that was firm without performing firmness, and said simply, "Show me." Harlan Fulton was sitting on the porch rail, his rifle across his knees. He had not left the property since the night of the storm. He watched Dr. Bancroft with the measuring gaze he applied to everyone who came up the mountain, but when Margot nodded at him, he settled back and let them pass. Margot led her through the gap in the cracked wall and down the 22 stone steps. She watched Dr. Bancroft's face as the examination light swept across the underground chamber for the first time. The beam moved slowly across the racks of painting, the shelves of manuscript cases, the pedestal at the far end. Dr. Bancroft did not gasp. She did not cry. She went completely silent for nearly a full minute, standing motionless at the bottom of the stairs, with one hand pressed flat against the concrete wall as if she needed the support. Then she set her equipment bag on the rubber matting, pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves, and walked to the nearest painting. She examined the first canvas for 45 minutes without speaking a single word. She used a jeweler's loupe, a UV pen light, and a handheld spectrometer to analyze the pigment layers. She photographed the institutional catalog tag wired to the frame cross, referencing the number against a database on her laptop that she had carried down the stairs balanced on one arm. When she finally straightened up and looked at Margot, her expression was one that Margot would never forget. Professional awe fused with something that looked very much like grief. "Mrs. Prescott," Dr. Bancroft said, her voice steady but carrying a tremor at its edges. "This painting has been on the Smithsonian's missing inventory list since 1958. It was officially classified as destroyed in a storage facility incident that was later attributed to water damage. I have spent 11 years of my career trying to determine what happened to the items lost in that incident." She paused, her gloved hand resting gently on the edge of the gilded frame. "There are curators who built their entire careers around the theory that these works no longer existed." Margot stood beside her in the cold, still air of the chamber and felt the weight of what Dr. Bancroft was saying settle onto her shoulders. 11 years. This woman had spent 11 years searching for answers that had been waiting 67 years underground, less than 4 hours from Washington, sealed behind a steel door by a man the institution had fired and forgotten. But Dr. Bancroft also brought news that landed in Margot's stomach like a stone. That evening they sat in the study with mugs of black coffee, the kerosene lantern casting their shadows long against the bookshelves. Dr. Bancroft told Margot what she had already suspected, but needed to hear spoken aloud. "When I report this discovery, it will move through the institutional chain of command. And in that chain sits Grover Braddock, Blaine Braddock's grandson board member since 2018. I do not trust him, but I do not have the authority to bypass him entirely." Margot looked at her across the desk that had once been Whitfield Pennington's, across the fountain pens and the leather blotter and the photograph of a man with a crate in his arms. "Then we need to make sure that by the time he finds out, it is too late for him to do anything about it." Dr. Bancroft studied her with an expression that shifted from surprise to something closer to respect. "You think like a strategist, Mrs. Prescott. I think like a teacher. I know which kid will copy someone else's paper if I turn my back." Over the next 2 days, Dr. Bancroft conducted her preliminary survey of the entire chamber, working 18-hour shifts. Margot brought sandwiches down the stone steps every 6 hours and sat on the bottom stair eating her own, while she listened to Dr. Bancroft make encrypted calls to colleagues in Washington. The voices on the other end rose in disbelief through the phone's tiny speaker, and each time Dr. Bancroft's responses were the same: calm, precise, patient, the voice of a woman accustomed to delivering impossible news and waiting for it to be absorbed. The preliminary inventory confirmed what Margot had glimpsed by lantern light. 14 paintings spanning 4 centuries of American and European art, including 3 works attributed to artists whose names appeared on the covers of museum catalogs in every library in America. 27 manuscripts and document collections, including correspondence journals and draft texts of historical significance that scholars had assumed were permanently lost. 41 scientific instruments dating from the 18th and 19th centuries, several bearing the personal marks of inventors and naturalists whose contributions had shaped modern science. And the cornerstone, the small painting on the oak pedestal. Dr. Bancroft examined it for over 2 hours in absolute silence, using every instrument in her kit, comparing pigment samples against reference databases, photographing brushstrokes at magnifications that revealed individual bristle marks in centuries-old paint. When she finished, she sat down on the rubber matting, removed her gloves, and pressed her hands against her face. Margot lowered herself onto the matting beside her. The concrete was cold through her jeans. She did not ask immediately. She waited the way she had learned to wait after decades of marriage, the way she had waited with Darla Pennington, the way she waited with her 4th graders when they were struggling to say something important. Silence, she had learned, is sometimes the most generous thing you can offer another person. If this is authentic, Dr. Bancroft said at last, lowering her hands. Her eyes were red. And every preliminary indicator tells me it is. This painting was believed to have been destroyed in a private collection fire in 1919. Its loss has been mourned by the art world for over a century. Conservative auction estimates for a work of this attribution and provenance would begin at $40 million. She shook her head slowly. But its cultural value, the fact that it exists, that it survived, that it was saved by a man who gave up everything to protect it, that is incalculable. They climbed the stairs together in silence. At the top, Dr. Bancroft stopped and looked back down into the darkness below. He built the perfect archive, she said almost to herself. No electricity, no mechanical systems, nothing to fail, just stone and concrete and copper and the mountain itself. It is the most elegant preservation environment I have ever seen, and it was designed by a man who had been fired and had nothing left but his expertise and his conscience. Margot waited until Dr. Bancroft had finished her 2nd day of documentation before she made the phone call she had been planning since the night of the storm. She sat on the porch in the cold November air, Harlan Fulton whittling a piece of hickory at the far end, and dialed the number for Sylvie Pemberton. The Washington Post reporter answered on the 2nd ring. She had been waiting. Margot could hear it in the controlled eagerness of her voice, the way she said, "Mrs. Prescott," as if the name had been sitting on her tongue for days. "Miss Pemberton, I have a story for you. On my terms. You do not publish anything until I say you can. And when you do publish, you tell it right. This is a story about a man named Whitfield Pennington. Not about me." Lena agreed without hesitation. Margot told her about the red wax letter, the director's handwritten order to classify stolen works as water damaged, the institutional cover-up that had protected Blaine Braddock for 67 years. There was a long silence on the line when Margot finished. Then Lena said very quietly, "This is the museum world's Watergate." "This is my shield," Margot said. "If Grover Braddock tries to bury this you publish, he will have to back down. You know this also means your life will never be quiet again." Margot looked out at the ridgeline where the morning fog was burning off the valley below in slow white ribbons. "My life was quiet for nearly 50 years. Look where that got me." Tom glanced up from his whittling. He had heard Margot's side of the conversation. He did not comment. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he recognizes a tactical decision he agrees with, and went back to his wood. The shield was needed sooner than Margot expected. Within 48 hours of Dr. Bancroft's first encrypted report to the Inspector General's office, Grover Braddock knew. He called Dr. Bancroft directly, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man accustomed to institutional deference, and demanded that all activity at the site be suspended until the full board could convene. Dr. Bancroft refused. The Office of the Inspector General operated independently of the board. Braddock escalated. He retained a Washington law firm to argue that Whitfield Pennington's archival documents constituted defamation of a deceased individual and should be suppressed pending judicial review. Simultaneously, Leander Ellsworth filed the guardianship petition he had threatened Margot with on the porch, arguing that her occupation of the property constituted endangerment of historic assets. Margot received the news from Faye Caldwell in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, the longest conversation they had shared. Katie laid out both threats with the clinical precision of someone who had spent the past several weeks transforming from an overwhelmed junior attorney into something altogether sharper. Braddock from Washington, Ellsworth from the Virginia courts. If either one succeeds, you lose control of the house and everything the recovery depends on. Katie paused. But Mrs. Prescott, neither petition has merit. The defamation claim is absurd. You cannot defame a man who died in 1994 with documents he wrote himself. And the guardianship petition will collapse the moment we demonstrate that the property is under active federal recovery supervision. They are stalling. They need time. We cannot give it to them. Then do not give it to them, Margot said. Katie filed emergency responses to both petitions within 24 hours. She had not slept, and Margot could hear it in her voice, but she could also hear something else. The sound of a young woman discovering that she was not in fact outgunned. She had been outgunned in the divorce proceedings because the system was designed to favor the side with more money. This was a different fight. This fight had facts, and Faye Caldwell, as it turned out, was very good with facts. Then Grover Braddock himself arrived at Pennington Hollow. He came on a Thursday morning, stepping out of a black town car that looked even more absurd on the gravel drive than any vehicle that had preceded it. He was younger than Margot expected, mid-50s, with the polished confidence of a man who had inherited not just money, but the certainty that money confers. His attorney, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a briefcase that cost more than Margot's car, flanked him 2 steps behind. I am here to inspect the documentation pertaining to my grandfather, Braddock announced as he approached the porch, directing his words not at Margot, but at the U.S. Marshal who had been posted at the property since the federal preservation order was issued 3 days earlier. I have a right to review materials that reference my family by name. The marshal, a broad-shouldered woman named Crandall, who had said approximately 12 words in 3 days, held up one hand. Sir, this is a secured federal site, no unauthorized access. Braddock's jaw tightened. He looked past the marshal to the porch where Margot stood next to Dr. Bancroft and for the first time addressed Margot directly. Mrs. Prescott, you do not understand who you are dealing with. Margot looked at him. She had spent 28 years in parent-teacher conferences. She had sat across the table from fathers who believed their money entitled them to dictate curriculum, men who leaned forward in their chairs and used their voices the way other people use tools. Men who assumed that a woman who spent her career in an elementary classroom could be made to retreat with a firm tone and an expensive suit. Grover Braddock was that father. She had met him 100 times. She had never once retreated. Mr. Braddock, Margot said, I understand exactly who I am dealing with. You are a man trying to protect your family's name by threatening a retired school teacher. I have met that kind of parent many times. Dr. Bancroft stepped forward before Braddock could respond. Her voice carried the flat, unassailable authority of 3 decades at the institution his grandfather had robbed. Mr. Braddock, your grandfather removed works from the National Collection over a period of 3 years. The institution you sit on the board of covered it up. The documentation is preserved and will be made public in full. You may leave voluntarily or Marshal Crandall will escort you. Braddock stared at both women. His attorney touched his elbow and murmured something Margot could not hear. For a moment, nobody moved. The wind came across the ridge and stirred the bare branches of the oaks and carried with it the smell of wood smoke from Harlan Fulton's cabin 1/2 mile through the trees. Then Grover Braddock turned and walked back to the town car without another word. The door closed, the engine started. The car reversed slowly down the gravel drive and disappeared into the forest, and Margot stood on the porch of the house that Whitfield Pennington had sealed and listened to the sound of it fade until there was nothing left but the wind and the birds and the vast, indifferent silence of the mountain. 3 weeks later, Sylvie Pemberton called. Braddock resigned from the board this morning. He knows the story is coming. 2 weeks after that, Ellsworth's guardianship petition was dismissed. The federal judge noted in her ruling that the petitioner's standing was dubious at best and obstructive at worst. The formal recovery operation began the following week. A convoy of climate-controlled transport vehicles arrived at Pennington Hollow under the escort of U.S. Marshals dispatched by the same federal judge who had dismissed Ellsworth's petition. The vehicles came up the gravel drive in a slow procession that Harlan Fulton watched from his porch rail with an expression Margot could not quite read. Reverence, perhaps, or the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 58 years guarding a secret and was finally watching it be carried into the light. The operation took 4 days. A team of 12 conservators, technicians, and federal agents worked from dawn to dusk under Dr. Bancroft's supervision. The process was meticulous to the point of ceremony. Each object was photographed in situ from multiple angles before being touched. Condition reports were dictated into recorders. Climate readings were taken at hourly intervals. The chamber that Whitfield Pennington had carved from bedrock and sealed with nothing but concrete and copper pipes had maintained conditions so stable that Dr. Bancroft's instruments showed temperature and humidity variations of less than 2% over the course of an average day. Several of the younger technicians stopped to stare at the ventilation system with something approaching disbelief. Margot watched from the top of the stone steps as each piece emerged from the underground darkness into daylight for the first time in 67 years. 14 paintings lifted from their felt-lined racks by hands wearing white cotton gloves carried up the narrow staircase with the kind of care usually reserved for the living. 27 manuscript cases cradled against technicians' chests, their contents centuries old and impossibly fragile. 41 velvet-lined boxes of scientific instruments, their brass surfaces catching the November sun as they surfaced in flaring briefly gold. On the second day of the operation, Margot went down to the chamber to check on the team and found Dr. Bancroft standing alone in front of the empty rack where the paintings had hung. The felt pads still bore the impressions of the frames that had rested against them for 67 years. Dr. Bancroft was running her fingers along one of the impressions, tracing the outline of an absence. "Are you all right?" Margot asked. Dr. Bancroft turned. "I have spent my career finding things that were supposed to be lost. I have pulled paintings from attics and manuscripts from bank vaults and artifacts from the back rooms of estate sales. But I have never stood in a place like this." He did not just hide them. He built them a home. He gave them better care than the institution that was supposed to protect them ever did. She paused, and then he walked away and died in a rented room above a hardware store, and nobody ever thanked him. "We are thanking him now," Margot said. On the final morning, the cornerstone was the last piece to leave the chamber. Dr. Bancroft carried it herself, the small painting of the woman by the window wrapped in acid-free tissue and placed inside a climate-controlled case that two technicians had spent an hour preparing. She climbed the 22 steps slowly, one at a time, her arms steady, her face set with concentration. At the top, she paused. She looked at Margot, and something passed between them that did not require words. The look of two women who understood what it meant to protect something precious, in a world that had repeatedly told them their protection was unnecessary. Then Dr. Bancroft walked to the last vehicle and placed the case inside and closed the door. Harlan Fulton had come down from his end of the porch and was standing beside Margot as the convoy prepared to depart. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, a gesture Margot had never seen him make. He looked smaller without the rifle, without the hat, without the deliberate armor of a man who had spent decades keeping the world at a measured distance. "Walter would have wanted to see this," he said quietly. "He would have wanted to know they made it." "They made it," Margot said, "because of him and because of you." Tom put his hat back on and walked to the edge of the porch and watched the convoy begin its slow descent down the gravel drive. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Dr. Bancroft climbed the porch steps one last time and stood beside Margot, both of them watching the vehicles disappear into the tree line one by one until the gravel drive was empty and the ridge was quiet again. "He saved them," Dr. Bancroft said. "Whitfield, Pennington. He saved all of them, and nobody knew." "His daughter knew," Margot said. "She has been carrying it alone for 60 years. The federal investigation that followed pulled threads that led directly to Niles Halstead. Two FBI agents arrived at Pennington Hollow in mid-December to interview Margot, sitting at the kitchen table while she made them coffee on the cook stove. They were polite, thorough, and visibly fascinated by the house. One of them, a woman in her 40s named Agent Merrifield, kept looking at the hand pump sink with the expression of someone trying to reconcile its existence with the 21st century. Margot told them everything she knew: the blind trust, the 20-year ownership, the watch with the initials WG, the two locksmith visits Harlan Fulton had witnessed, the intruders during the storm. She told them about Darla Pennington and the coerced sale of the property. She told them about the $75,000 offer and the guardianship threat and the look on Leander Ellsworth's face when she had told him to get off her land. Agent Merrifield took notes and asked careful questions, and at one point set down her pen and looked at Margot with an expression that was not professional at all. "Mrs. Prescott, I have been with the Bureau for 16 years. I have investigated art crime on 3 continents. This is the most significant recovery I have ever been involved with, and it happened because a paralegal put a property in the wrong column on a spreadsheet. And because a conservator loaded a truck in the middle of the night 67 years ago," Margot said. "Yes," Agent Merrifield said. "And because of that, investigators traced the blind trust through financial records that Niles had believed were impenetrable. They were not. The emails recovered from his personal accounts revealed a plan years in the making. Detailed correspondence with a dealer in London who specialized in works with incomplete provenance. Discussions of shipping routes, authentication strategies, and the fabrication of ownership documentation that would allow stolen institutional works to be sold as legitimate private collection pieces. The estimated value of the planned operation based on the dealer's own projections exceeded $120 million. Niles had known for 20 years what was beneath that house. He had purchased the property with the specific intent of eventually looting it. The only reason he had waited was the same fear that had kept Whitfield Pennington away. Fear that opening the house would draw attention. His plan had always been to wait until institutional memory faded and then quietly extract the collection. And then his own attorney's paralegal had put the property in the wrong column on a spreadsheet, and everything had come apart. The federal indictment was handed down on a Monday in late January. Niles Halstead was charged with conspiracy to traffic in stolen cultural property, money laundering, and fraud. Leander Ellsworth was charged as a co-conspirator. Margot watched the news coverage on a small television at Ruby's Diner in Dunlap Station, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee, while Royce Whitaker sat beside her, shaking his head. "That man drove up here in a Mercedes trying to buy you off for $75,000, Boyd said. And the whole time he was sitting on $100 million secret." Margot took a sip of her coffee. "He was not sitting on it, Boyd, I was." Boyd laughed for the first time since Margot had known him. It was a short, dry sound like a branch snapping, but it was real. He shook his head and poured her another cup without being asked. The personal reckonings arrived one by one, each carrying its own particular weight. Althea Holloway vacated Niles's Charlotte residence within 72 hours of the indictment. Her departure was swift and frictionless. She left the way Niles had left Margot, without explanation and without looking back. Margot felt nothing when she heard this. Not satisfaction, not vindication. She felt the peculiar emptiness of watching a pattern repeat itself, the same cruelty performed by a different hand, and understanding that some people move through the world, leaving the same wound everywhere they go. Leland released a public statement through his firm, distancing himself from his father. The corporate language was careful and bloodless, the prose of a man more concerned with his client list than his conscience. Margot read it on her phone sitting on the porch and set the phone down without comment. Opal called Margot for the first time in 3 months. Margot listened to her daughter's stammered attempt at reconnection for 17 seconds before interrupting gently. "Opal, I love you. I have always loved you. But I am not going to pretend that you did not choose convenience over loyalty when it mattered. You are welcome to visit me. You are welcome in my home. But you will come because you want to see your mother, not because your father's name is in the newspaper. Do you understand?" The silence on the other end lasted long enough for Margot to hear Opal breathing. It was the most honest sound her daughter had made in years. "Yes, Mom," she whispered. "I understand." A month later, Leland called. It was not a 10-minute call. It lasted 47 minutes. He did not apologize. He did not know how. But he asked about the house, the cat, Royce Whitaker, Ruby's Diner. He asked questions that required him to listen to the answers, which was something he had not done since he was a boy sitting at Margot's kitchen table doing homework while she cooked dinner. At the end of the call, he said, "Della took down the dinner party photo. I am sorry about that, Mom." "That is a beginning, Leland, not an ending." "I know," he said. And for the first time, Margot believed he might actually mean it. Margot did not give interviews. She did not appear on morning shows. When a producer from a major network offered a 6-figure fee for an exclusive sit-down, she declined with a single sentence. "This story is not about me. It is about a man named Whitfield Pennington who deserves to be remembered for what he saved, not what he suffered." The producer paused. Margot could hear the recalculation happening in real time. The producer adjusting her understanding of who this woman was and what she wanted. "Mrs. Prescott, with respect, you are the story. The public wants to know about you. The public wants to know about a sealed house and a hidden collection. Whitfield Pennington gave them that. I just opened the door." She hung up and did not answer when the producer called back. The Smithsonian's formal acknowledgement came 6 months after the recovery in a ceremony held in the institution's castle building on the National Mall. Margot attended at Dr. Bancroft's personal invitation, wearing a navy dress she had purchased at a second-hand shop in Dunlap Station, and the pearl earrings her own mother had given her on her wedding day. She did not come alone. Darla Pennington sat in a wheelchair at the front of the ceremony hall, her small frame wrapped in the same hand-knitted afghan she had worn the day Margot first visited her in the Dunmore facility. Harlan Fulton stood behind the wheelchair, his back straight in the unconscious posture of a man who had served, his rough hands resting on the push handles with a gentleness that no one who had seen him on the mountain rifle in hand would have believed possible. Faye Caldwell sat in the second row wearing a blazer that fit her properly for the first time since Margot had known her. She had been offered a position at a Washington firm specializing in cultural property law. She had accepted. The printer that jammed every third page was behind her now. The secretary of the Smithsonian presented a formal citation recognizing the recovery of a culturally significant collection. The citation named Whitfield Pennington as the conservator whose courage and sacrifice had preserved the works for future generations. A permanent exhibition was announced to be housed in a dedicated gallery bearing Pennington's name. When the secretary spoke Walter's name into the microphone, Ruth reached up without looking and found Margot's hand. She held it, and she cried, and she did not wipe the tears away. They fell onto the afghan and darkened the yarn, and Margot held the old woman's hand and let her cry because some tears have waited 60 years to fall, and they deserve to arrive without interference. Tom stood behind them both, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on a point above the secretary's head. He did not cry, but his hands on the wheelchair handles tightened until his knuckles went white, and when the audience rose to applaud, he remained standing exactly where he was, the last century still guarding something precious, even now that the guarding was done. After the ceremony, Sylvie Pemberton published her story in the Washington Post. It ran as a long-form feature. The headline named Whitfield Pennington. The article focused on his career, his discovery, his sacrifice, and the 67-year journey of the objects he had saved. Margot was mentioned in the final paragraphs briefly and without embellishment, exactly as she had requested. Under the terms of the federal cultural recovery statutes, Margot was entitled to a finder's fee calculated as a percentage of the appraised insurance value of the recovered collection. The amount was deposited into her account 4 months after the ceremony. $38 million. Margot sat in the study at Whitfield Pennington's desk when she saw the number on her bank statement. She set the paper down and looked at the framed photograph beside it. The man with the crate, the open doorway, the woman behind him carrying another crate inside. June 1958. She picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The first was to the Mecklenburg County Public School District, where she established a full scholarship program in her mother's name. Every year, for as long as the trust endured, a student from the district who wanted to become a teacher would have their education fully funded. Margot specified no conditions beyond one. The recipient had to want to teach, not to earn, not to advance, to teach. The second call was to an attorney in Dunmore, Virginia, who set up a care trust for Darla Pennington. The trust would cover every expense Ruth would ever incur for the rest of her life. Medical care, the private room she deserved, fresh flowers every week if she wanted them. Margot had asked Ruth once what she missed most about living outside the facility, and Ruth had said, without hesitation, cut flowers, the kind my mother used to put on the kitchen table. So the trust included a standing order with a florist in Dunmore. Irises and daisies, every Tuesday. The third call was to a contractor in Dunlap Station. She kept the house on Pennington Hollow Road. The stone walls were repointed by a master mason from Roanoke who spent 3 weeks on the ridge and told Margot it was the finest fieldstone construction he had seen in 40 years of work. The roof was restored with matching Virginia slate. A local contractor ran grid power up the ridge for the first time, and a well was drilled that hit clean water at 90 feet. Margot kept the hand pump sink in the kitchen because she liked the sound it made. She kept the cast iron cook stove because on cold mornings it filled the kitchen with a warmth that radiated from the iron and settled into the stone walls and held there for hours. She kept the study exactly as Whitfield Pennington had left it. The bookshelves, the fountain pens, the leather blotter, the framed photograph. The archival boxes were gone, returned to the Smithsonian along with everything they documented. But the shelves were not empty. Margot filled them with her own books, her own photographs. The cardboard box of memories that Niles's attorney had deemed of no financial value now sat on the shelf where box 17 had been the box that had held the red wax letter that brought down a legacy of theft and silence. Harlan Fulton came for dinner every Saturday. He brought apple cider he brewed in his cabin from a recipe he would not share. Margot cooked on the cast iron stove, roast chicken, potatoes, cornbread from her mother's recipe. They did not talk much. Both of them were people of silence. But this silence had choice in it. It had comfort. It had the sound of fire and wind through open windows and a grandfather clock that Margot had wound for the first time on a Sunday morning in December, its chiming carrying across the ridge to Tom's cabin the way it had when Whitfield Pennington was alive. Tom heard it. He did not mention it. But the following Saturday, he brought a bottle of his best cider instead of the usual jug, and he stayed an hour longer than usual. And when he left, he paused on the porch steps and looked up at the house with an expression Margot had never seen on his face before. It was gratitude, not for the dinner, not for the company, for the sound of the clock, for the light in the window, for the proof that some things once broken can be made whole again. On the desk in the study beside the photograph of Whitfield Pennington sat a pocket watch with the initials WG engraved on the case. The FBI had recovered it from Niles's possessions during the asset seizure and returned it to Darla Pennington as personal property. Ruth had sent it to Margot in an envelope with a short note written in a hand that trembled but did not waver. My father always said someone would come, someone who would open the door for the right reasons. You are that person. The watch belongs to the house. The underground chamber was sealed again. Reinforced concrete cap, steel access hatch. Nothing remained inside. The paintings were in museums. The manuscripts were in archives. The scientific instruments were in research collections. The room was empty. But Margot went down the 22 steps sometimes just to stand in the silence and remember. The chamber still held the faint scent that had greeted her the first time she opened the front door of the house, and in that scent she found a kind of peace she had never expected to feel again. On a warm evening in late May, 8 months after she had first turned a brass key in the lock of a sealed house on a Virginia ridgeline, Margot sat on the restored front porch with a glass of iced tea and a yellow tabby cat that had appeared on her doorstep 3 weeks earlier and refused to leave. She had named him Penny. The sun was setting behind the Blue Ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that made the stone walls of the house glow as if lit from within. The 12 acres of ridgeline spread out before her. The dead goldenrod cleared, the thistle cut back, the old oaks pruned and standing tall against the fading light. She thought about Niles awaiting trial in Charlotte with his assets frozen and his reputation destroyed. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt something closer to the exhaustion that follows a long illness, the kind where you are grateful to be through it, but too tired to celebrate. She did not hate Niles. Hatred requires an ongoing investment of energy, and Margot had better uses for what remained of hers. Opal had visited for a weekend in April. She arrived on a Friday evening in a rental car pulling up the gravel drive with the cautious pace of someone not sure she was welcome. Margot was waiting on the porch. She had seen the headlights winding up the mountain road for 10 minutes and had used that time to prepare herself for the particular difficulty of loving someone who has disappointed you and choosing to leave the door open anyway. Opal got out carrying a small suitcase and a potted peace lily, the kind of gift you bring when you do not know what else to bring. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her mother with the expression of a woman who had rehearsed what she wanted to say during the entire flight from Denver and forgotten every word. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Come inside," Margot said. "I made dinner." She slept in the guest room, which Margot had furnished with a bed from the antique shop in Dunlap Station and curtains sewn from fabric Royce Whitaker's wife had given her. On Saturday, they painted the kitchen cabinets together, a pale sage green that caught the morning light. They worked side by side for hours, and the rhythm of brushing and sanding gave them something to do with their hands while the silence between them slowly lost its sharpness. Saturday evening, Margot cooked roast chicken and potatoes on the cast iron stove. Opal set the table the way she had been taught as a girl. Fork on the left knife and spoon on the right napkin folded in a triangle. The muscle memory of a childhood that had been despite everything that followed a good one. They ate, and Opal cried. Not dramatically. The tears simply arrived falling into her plate while she held her fork and did not move. Margot reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's hand and held it there. They did not talk about Niles. They did not talk about the renovation that had been more important than offering Margot a bed. They talked about Opal's garden in Denver, about the tomatoes she was trying to grow at altitude, and the deer that ate her hostas. They talked about Penny the cat and his habit of sleeping on the kitchen counter. They talked about the sound the hand pump made when you worked the handle, the rhythmic squeak and gush that made the house seem like it was breathing. It was not reconciliation. Margot understood that real reconciliation would take years and might never arrive complete. It was something smaller and more honest, a new foundation being poured carefully in the space where the old one had cracked. The front door of the house was never locked anymore. There was nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. What had been sealed was open. What had been hidden was seen. What had been overlooked, a house, a woman, a legacy, had proven itself to be the most valuable thing in the room. Penny the cat stretched in a patch of fading sunlight and yawned. Margot scratched behind his ears and watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. She was 69 years old. She was alone on a ridge in Virginia with a cat, a restored stone house, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the most important chapter of her life had not ended with loss. It had begun with a sealed door and the courage to open it. Somewhere down the mountain in the town of Dunlap Station, Royce Whitaker was closing up the hardware store for the evening. He paused at the door, looked up at the ridgeline where a single light now burned in the window of the old Pennington house, and smiled. "About time somebody turned a light on up there," he said to no one in particular, and he locked up and went home.